Michael, thank you very much for coming in.
It's a pleasure.
Where does your interest in politics come from? Did you grow up in a very political household?
No, not a political household, but a sort of, I suppose, in retrospect, not that I was aware of it at the time, but a sort of political crucible. I come from South Wales Valleys area. I come from a town called Port Talbot, primarily known for two things, I suppose. One, it's steelworks. It was at one time the largest steelworks in Europe, and the major employer for the area. And the other thing the town is known for is, bizarrely, actors. Richard Burton came from Pontrhydyfen, which is part of the area. Anthony Hopkins came from Taibach. Myself, and I always say Rob Brydon as well, because he gets very upset if I don't mention him. So, bizarrely, the place represents two different aspects of my life, I suppose. And for the first part of my life, I was totally unaware, in some ways, of the other aspect of it. So I was so obsessed with acting. Well, my first obsession was football. That was all I wanted to do when I was growing up.
And you were good, weren't you?
I was good for a 12-year-old, yeah. I hit my peak at 12. It was downhill from there on. But I was very good, and there was the possibility of continuing down that road. I mean, how far, I don't know. It's an even more precarious profession than acting, probably, or even politics. So I don't know what would have happened. But at a certain point, there was a kind of a switch over, and my obsession became acting. And that was partly because, well, not partly, that was mainly because of the combination of my family being very into it, and my family had been into amateur operatics and that kind of stuff. So I'd grown up around performance. The fact that within the culture of my area, it was a noble profession. Yeah. You know, Richard Burton was a man's man. It wasn't a sissy
thing for boys to do, yeah.
Richard Burton, Anthony Hopkins, these were men's men, and there was a kind of dark edge to what they did, and it was seen as a noble thing to go into and a respected thing. So that was a big part of it. But I think mainly the biggest part of it was that there was a pathway there. You know, I was coming from an area that was, we're talking around 84, 85. I would have been 14, 15. You know, the miners' strike was on. The area was right at the heart of that in the South Wales, mining communities. I was totally unaware of it. I had no idea that was going on. I was so focused on acting, youth theatre, that kind of. I was in a little bubble there.
Really? When you say totally unaware, I mean you just weren't following.
I can't remember. I don't remember. I mean, it must have been.
So you don't remember being a supporter of the miners as a kid?
No, in no way. Yeah. I had no feelings either way about it at the time. If I was aware of it at all, it was just something that was going on that I just assumed was going on everywhere, and that wasn't specific or unique to my area at all. So, I mean, it seems weird now, thinking back, but I came to this very late. my awareness of, I was just so one-track minded about acting and going where I was going to go and doing what I was going to do. And I suppose the irony, in a way, is that it was by following that one-track minded path that eventually brought me back to the town, and a growing awareness of the political class, social struggle that had been playing out in that area for centuries.
Because your family's still there.
My family is still there, yeah.
Because what did your parents do, or what do your parents do?
My dad and my mum and my sister were all essentially in the same area, which used to be called personnel, is now called HR, I think.
So this is funny in that I'm going to skip over the bit of your career that most people probably want to talk about, which is the hugely successful acting bit. But at some point in time over the last few years, you've obviously had some sort of awakening going back. And what has been that process?
Well, I suppose the major catalyst for it was in 2010. Earlier than that, 2008, 2009, I was approached by the newly established National Theatre of Wales. So within Wales, there had been an argument for years and years and years about a national theatre for Wales. And nothing had ever happened. And eventually, it was made a reality. And I was approached and asked whether I wanted to do something. And I thought, oh, God, you know, they're going to ask me to do, this sounds so arrogant, they're going to ask me to do Hamlet in Cardiff or something. I got no interest, you know. So I turned up with this kind of attitude, and they talked about, well, look, what we want to do is we want to do productions that are much more rooted in the community. We're looking to move out of theatres, possibly, you know, really explore what theatre can be, that's much closer to the communities. We're not looking at being based in Cardiff in a building. We're looking at, you know, we are wherever the productions happen. I thought, well, that's sort of a bit more interesting. And they said, so, you know, would you be interested in doing something? And I said, well, the only community in Wales that I would in any way be able to or feel interested in doing something about would be in Port Talbot, where I come from. So that essentially then started developing, that developed into what became something that is known as the Passion of Port Talbot, which took about 2.5 years for me to develop over time. And ultimately in 2011, over the Easter weekend, we did a single performance, non-stop, for 72 hours that involved about 2,000 local people who took part in it in one way or another. And it began at dawn on Friday morning on the beach. And about 150 people were there to witness that. And by the Sunday night, I was being crucified on a roundabout in front of the beach there. And there was, depending on who you listen to, anywhere between 12 to 20,000 people all at that area. And it was an extraordinary event. But the work in developing it that happened over the few years beforehand essentially meant that I was spending a lot more time in my hometown than I had for years and years and years. By this point, I was based in America. My daughter grew up in Los Angeles, and I wanted to be with her, so I based myself there. But it meant that I was coming and spending big chunks of time back in Port Talbot, working with people within the community. One of the things that I set myself the task for was that I wanted to meet as many people in the community and as many organizations as I could in the community and get a real sense of what this community was and what their aspirations were and what they were afraid of and what their hopes and fears were and all that kind of stuff. In a way, it was a sort of riff on Under Milk Wood, the Dylan Thomas thing, where he talks about the dreams of the town. You know, what would that town dream of if you could look into their dreams at night? So it was sort of weirdly a sort of a riff on that. But what happened was that I had my eyes opened. You know, I came at it from a theatrical point of view and a creative point of view. But what actually happened was that I started to see not just the specifics of what happens within a community like Port Talbot, but any community in a way. But particularly in an area, as I became more and more aware, that are one of those areas that people talk about, one of those places that feel left behind, that, you know, deindustrialization affected that area massively. And a growing awareness of what the miners' strike was actually about and the long-term consequences of it. And I suppose in some ways, ultimately, a kind of a forerunner of what I was really started to try and confront with the Brexit vote 5 years later or whatever. So I started to see that there were these organizations, real grassroots organizations, trying to support and help people in the community who needed help, who you know, had no money, or at their most vulnerable, at their, you know, them had so little opportunity and who needed support, you know. Organizations, like tiny organizations that were there to give carers a break for one night a week, young carers a break for one night a week. And, you know, like they'd take them 10-pin bowling in Swansea and, you know, just were looking for the money to get a bus to get there, you know, just things like that. That then I would be there, I would go away for a couple of months, I would come back and they were gone, because whatever money there was had gone in the meantime, you know. And so I did start to get a growing awareness of my town, like where I came from, and where I had been given such opportunity, and I'd gone off and had this life of immense privilege and opportunity and wonderful, wonderful life. And yet that same town, this was going on in it, you know. And
is there a bit of guilt in there about your own success? Or?
I don't know. Well, people ask that about guilt. No, it's incandescent fury that that is the case. It's not to do with me feeling guilty about what happened for me. It's a sense of, why isn't that available for other people? Why Why should this be the case? You know, I did a job, an acting job recently called Good Omens, which will be coming out later next year, I think. And we filmed in Oxfordshire for a bit of it. And I remember we were filming within David Cameron's constituency there. And it is beautiful. It's an absolutely beautiful picture postcard kind of place. These gorgeous communities, thatched roof houses, you know, it's just beautiful. And I would go from there to Port Talbot. And I just thought, this is wrong. This is wrong that these people have this and where I come from doesn't have it. And it just makes me, it just infuriates me. And then when you start to learn a bit more about what that actually entails, what the nuts and bolts of that entails. And, you know, people talk about the poverty premium. And I get into trouble sometimes because I talk about Port Talbot in these terms, and people say, we're not all poor in Port Talbot, you know, and so I have to make that clear. But it's my experience, you know, of certain elements of any community, but particularly those communities in that area. And it does infuriate me. Now, it's not guilt. And I think it's important for me to say that it's not guilt, it's a sense of responsibility. That if there are certain people and certain groups within communities, all not just in Britain, all across the world, but particularly in the area that I come from, who don't get a platform, who don't get the opportunity to speak out. If people like me, who have had opportunity and do have a platform and do have their own financial resources and all the rest of it, if we don't do something to help, then who's going to do it? You know, so when people say, "Oh, you're champagne socialist" and all that kind of stuff, yeah, fair enough. But who else if not me then? And I think that's something that everyone should ask themselves anyway.
I mean, what you've landed on is this sense of political failure, and you talked about it in a couple of sort of, you know, speeches and tweets and interviews, where you seem to feel that politicians just don't represent people anymore, and that people don't have, or people don't have the chance to choose the politics that they really want.
Yeah, I don't subscribe to this. They're all the same. I think that's dangerous. There are people who I have met who work in the political world who are hugely motivated with absolutely, you know, more passion than anyone else about getting change. And that's what drove them into it, and that's why they're doing what they do. You know, someone like Carolyn Harris, who couldn't afford to pay for her own child's funeral, and then, as a result, got into politics and is now changing the laws around that for other people. I mean, that's amazing. But nevertheless, I think there is a general thing, not just in politics, but, you know, in our society, in our culture, where there is a centralization of power that is not serving the needs of people. There is a disconnectedness between the places where people get to make decisions about how we live our lives and the people who are at the front line of those experiences. The flow of information through that network is not happening freely, and you know, and I think that is problematic, and that's what I would like to see changed.
I mean, you've mentioned Brexit a couple of times. I mean, what is your feeling on why people voted the way they did where you come from?
Well, I suppose the thing that I've been really thinking about a lot recently is that regardless of how you feel about leaving, remaining, you know, whether we're going to get a better deal, you know, or not, whether people are going to have less opportunity or more opportunity as a result. The thing I've been thinking about recently is that when that vote happened, it was such a shock to a lot of people. I mean, a lot of people who had voted to leave, I think it was a shock to, but it was a big shock, and particularly to people within what I suppose would be called the various bubbles in our society, within the Westminster bubble or the media bubble or, you know, metropolitan bubbles or whatever. It's a big shock. My personal position was to remain. Ultimately, it's not going to make any difference to me. My own personal circumstances, I'm fine. I'm not going to be affected by it particularly. But I was genuinely concerned, rightly or wrongly, that it would affect a lot of the people that I know back at home in an adverse way. And I may be wrong. I hope I'm wrong about that. But that was how I felt personally. But what was really shocking was that sense of, oh my God, this is a different country to what we thought it was. The reality that we thought we were in is not that. And there are these communities, there are these people who are incredibly angry and want change and feel like they're not being represented and heard. And there was a moment where a window opened to actually look at the issues that are creating that anger and that fury and that resentment and that frustration in those communities. And suddenly you saw people, you had Guardian writers coming down to Port Talbot for the first time, or suddenly on the news you started to hear voices and I thought, wow, well, I may not have wanted the vote to go the way it is, but if these communities are now going to start to be listened to and people are going to take them a bit more seriously, and you start hearing people who run museums in London talking about, we've got to, one thing that we've learned from Brexit is we've got to try and make connections with communities that are out there and all this kind of, when people start talking about that, you think, well, there's an opportunity for change here. This is a good thing. But I am now aware that that window is closing. That now people are just falling back into the rights and wrongs about Brexit, and everyone is getting comfortable again.
And no one's talking to those communities anymore.
All those people who were made very uncomfortable by that vote and the reaction of that vote, the result of that vote, have all found a way to become comfortable again. Now, that's natural. That's human nature, and no one likes to be uncomfortable, and everyone will always try and move consciously or unconsciously towards finding an equilibrium again. But that status quo was disrupted, and I think that was part of why a lot of people voted the way they did.
Around that time, I think you did an interview or two or said a few things that suggested, you warned that democracy was under threat, and you warned about fascism in Europe. Just what did you mean by that? What did you think the threat was, and do you still think it is?
Well, we've seen Nazis marching through America. We've seen Nazis, self-confessed Nazis, marching through European places. We've seen Leanne Wood was part of a Brexit discussion on TV, and whilst that was happening, death threats came in for her. It was scary what was going on. Joe Cox was murdered in the street. We've seen the rise of far-rightness, and not just the rise of it, but the emboldenedness of a far right that has always been there in the fringes and around, but they've come to prominence in all kinds of ways.
But at the same time, you want to be careful not to say everybody who voted Brexit is part of that.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. That's the whole point, in a way, is to go, it is too easy for people to just go, oh, well, it's just racist, isn't it? It's just people. And no, it's not. That's a complete waste of an opportunity to look at how we can make our country fairer and more equal. If inequality is one of the greatest scourges of our time, then when a moment comes where you're faced with the actual consequences of that inequality and you do everything you can to ignore it again, then that is that's not just a waste, it's dangerous, because it ain't going away. This is going to come out in some way or another, so you have to look into it. And that's why it really worries me that now we're sort of falling back into a quite comfortable place of rights and wrongs around leaving and remaining, and the customs union or custom partnership, all that stuff. A lot of people are just, you can hear it again about, just get on with it, just get on with it. What I think is behind that just get on with it thing is, again, you're going off into that elite thing, is going off into the same place again. You're missing the point. And I think it would be really dangerous for us as a society to not take that opportunity that the shock of that Brexit vote created. If there's one thing I've learned about life, is that anything that is repressed will come back and smack you in the face if you're not careful.
So your own response to this has been then to set about trying to change things, but change things on an individual issue level. You started this thing called the Alliance, which is about ending high-cost credit.
Yeah.
So why did you pick that as the issue on which to begin your...
I didn't. So what actually happened was that I at the risk of messing up what this podcast is about, I got no idea how you change the world. I don't even know if you can change the world. The world is something... The world is change. That is what, you can't change the world because its very nature is change. My whole life I felt like it's difficult just to keep up with the changes that are going around me, let alone changing things myself. There's the famous quote that is, cliche now, but I do think it's the most profound thing I've probably ever heard in my life, which is be the change you wish to see in the world. Growing up going to drama school and being around young actors, myself primarily being one of them, it's a lot of talk of, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to change this, and I'm going to do this, and you realise fairly soon that the only thing you can change is you.
But you're trying to change something here, right?
But this was the big thing. I realised at a certain point that if I if I was disturbed by certain things that are going on, and that's not just, I don't mean disturbed by the way the vote turned out with Brexit, and I think there's very connected things to do with the Trump election in America as well, that there were a lot of people who felt that they were being let down for whatever reason, and they can justify it and rationalize it in whatever way they want, but there were vast swathes of people who felt, rightly, I think, that the way things had moved in the world, a lot of the stuff to do with globalization and deindustrialization, that people were being left out. They just didn't have a say anymore. And if I was disturbed by that and disturbed by the potential consequences of that, because I think, on the one hand, you would hope that then, like I said, that opportunity would be taken to address those issues in a way that made things more equal. But if they're not, and I think this was part of the problem with the left, certainly in America, that the Democrats had moved so far away from what they were set up to do. And some people would say that that's what was happening with the Labour Party in Britain as well through the 90s and 2000s, I suppose. That rather than addressing those issues, that anger and that frustration was able to be tapped into by people with maybe agendas that were a bit more nefarious and a bit more self-serving than they were appearing to be. Now, if I was disturbed by that, I felt that if I wanted to do something about it, then I have to look at myself and go, what can I do? What have I got to offer to this? And in the same way as, I was saying about be the change you wish to see in the world, you go, well, this isn't about me getting on Twitter. This isn't about me lending my name to something. I got to do something. I want to get involved. I come from a town that voted overwhelmingly for Brexit. This is a town where people feel angry and left behind, and in those valleys areas, there's a lot of those communities feel that way. Who's speaking up for them? Who's doing that? Like, I've got a platform, I've got money, I've got a desire to do something about it. If I don't, then I've got no right to. I personally feel like I don't have a right to say what I think is terrible and complain about people, complain about the way things are going, when I actually have the resources to do something about it, even in a small way. So it was at that point that I realized that I had to step up. And so I thought, well, this is it then. This is when I make that change for me. I start being the thing that I want to see, which is people with the resources and the platform and the opportunity to get involved and make a change, positive change for people who don't have the same access to opportunity that others do and that I have. I need to be one of those people, and so that's what I've done.
And your campaign against high-cost credit is essentially around things like payday lending and that kind of stuff.
Well, it comes out. So I didn't go, I want to go into end high-cost credit campaigning work. That wasn't the way it worked. The way it worked was to go, what's going on in these communities? What is holding people back? What is unfair? What is the injustice that's going on here? And one of the things that started coming up was around, it's called the poverty premium. I suppose people refer to it as that. But the idea that the people who have least get charged the most for certain things. Now, people say, well, that's the way the market works. It's high risk. People have to pay more for this stuff. But then when you start looking into it, you go, no, there's a shift going on here. There is money being taken away from the poorest of communities and the poorest people, and it's being shifted out, it's being extracted out, and it's going to other places. And you can see inequality at work. And when you look historically at those same places in the area that I come from, in South Wales, the Industrial Revolution was an act of mass extraction out of Wales. I went up to North Wales last week to a festival up in Machynlleth, and to get from South Wales to North Wales is really difficult. There's no motorway going there. There's a reason for that historically, because all the infrastructure in Wales was created to get stuff out of Wales. It wasn't to connect Wales up. So there's a historical reason in my particular area there's a historical tradition of extraction out of it. When you look at around high cost credit, so Step Change did a report fairly recently where they said that 1.6 million people in 2016 were using high cost credit to just meet basic needs. When you look at the people who are doing that, tend to be geographically condensed in certain areas. The money that they're spending on that is not staying within that community. That money is going out of that community. So you can see that extraction is still going on. And it just seems wrong that the people in the communities that have suffered the most, that have gone through the hardest circumstances because of things out of their control to a large extent, because of deindustrialization, the collapse of the mining industries, and steel and iron and tin and all that kind of stuff. And why are they being punished in this way? When you look again, like I said, the fact that I look back at when I was 14 and 15 and it was going on, the miners' strike. Now I look at it and then you see that the Conservative government, Margaret Thatcher, wanted to take them down, wanted to take down the NUM and Scargill, and not just the mining industry. There was a conscious decision to move away from mining. That's absolutely irrefutable. But I think more than that, there was an attempt to declare war on a way of living, on a sort of communal way of living.
Well, why do you think that?
Well, because you look at she said there's no such thing as society. The idea of the celebration of the individual, that it's individuals who make the most of their hard work and their work ethic, and they're able to succeed, and that is the triumph of the individual, and we are a society, we're a country who are going to celebrate that. And the idea of people who need help, who are on welfare, is because they're lazy, and you shouldn't make it all right for them, because if they get too comfortable with that, they won't work hard enough to succeed. So we don't want to put money into welfare, we don't want to put money into a safety net. We want to make sure that it's as hard as possible for them, because it's for their own good. Now that presupposes a level playing field. There is no level playing field in Britain. There never has been a level playing field. If you look like you, if you have the colour of your skin, if you come from certain kinds of communities, if you sound a certain way, it's never been a level playing field. Now, that doesn't mean to say that individuals within that aren't able to succeed in certain ways. I came from that town, but I know full well why I succeeded. Part of it was to do with my own individual talent or whatever it is, but the vast majority of it was because of the work of other people to make opportunities be there for me, that there was a pathway for me, and that I was supported in that.
So to reverse this sort of extraction, have you got the answer to this one problem?
Well, so I was led towards this idea of high-cost credit because it seemed to me a quite extreme example, one extreme example of this basic injustice that's going on, not just in the communities that I come from, but across the country. And it seemed to me that there was an answer. There were people out there and companies out there who are trying to create a fairer deal for people. But again, because it's not a level playing field, those businesses weren't able to cut through. You look at, they have a marketing budget of £10,000 for the year. These high-cost credit, lenders have got millions and millions of pounds. They're being promoted on Facebook and Google, and they've got TV adverts on after all your favourite shows are on the TV. What the irony was, when I went out and did the launch of this alliance, and I was on TV shows, and they would cut to the advert break, and those companies would come up immediately. So, you associate, you got major football clubs promoting them. They're just everywhere. Whereas these other companies who are trying to do something else, or credit unions, or, all the organizations that are trying to fight this, you just don't hear about. You don't know about them as much, So I thought, well, that's one thing I can do. I can support that. I've got a bit of a platform. I can talk about that. But more than that, you have to get them to the point where they can compete. But you have to work in multiple ways at the same time. It's like that spinning plates thing you used to see with people at the play gym, and those variety acts with keeping all the plates spinning. There's a way to work with regulators and policymakers to push down on the worse end of the practices in high-cost credit and regulate and say put caps on and that stuff. But there's no point in doing that because the demand is there. People need to use this stuff. If you stop them from giving it, you've got to support the better deal at the same time. So it's no good doing one without the other. And if you're going to support the better deal, part of that better deal is also about being more responsible. So not necessarily giving credit to people who just have no way of paying it back. They're just going to get into trouble. So also you have to support the safety network for them, the safety net. That for people where credit is not an option, then what can help? How can we work with you to get you to a point where you are in a position where you have enough financial stability to be able to pay this back? So it has to be all those things at the same time. So I realized, well, I can do something about that. There's a bit that I can do with all of that, because I can get through the door into the regulator's office. I can get to meet the policymakers, even if it's just because they want me to sign their Twilight DVD for their kids. Whatever, I can get in that door. I can also have a media platform to kind of raise public awareness about what's actually going on, to see the injustice of what's going on and to talk about the alternatives, and I can bring a bit of money. I've learned that there's nothing you can.
You mean from people are prepared to give you money to do this?
You can access. There is loads of money around. I mean, not seeing it in the sort of communities I come from, but there is a lot of money around. There's nothing better to access money than by being able to put a bit of money in yourself first.
I'm sure you've been courted by politicians and political parties, and I'm sure that that they will want you to join them. Have you decided that you don't want to be an MP or a member of the House of Lords, or do politics that traditional way?
Well, it's about being effective, first and foremost for me. That moment that I talked about a few years ago where I realised that I either had to take a step back because the amount that I was getting involved with was so much, I couldn't sustain it. What was really going on there was me questioning how effective I was being. And I realised that I could be more effective, and the circumstances of my life allowed me to be more effective, and I wanted to be more effective, so I took that step forward. Now, that's something I ask myself every day now. How can I be any more effective? Can I do this differently? If the answer to that question was to join a political party, try and get a seat, try and get into Westminster, work my way up through the party, blah, blah. If I thought that was the most effective thing, then I would do it. For now, that's not. It's clear to me that I've got a system that I'm trying to build up at the moment where I do a film, I earn the money, I get the profile, I turn that money and profile into leverage in order to, or funding to make these things happen and push this work forward, then, that's working pretty well for me at the moment. If that changes, I'll think again. But for now, I've got a lot of the things that people in politics wish that they could have, and that's why they caught me, I suppose. I've got my own media platform. I've got my own, pathway between the highest offices of power to, what's going on in the streets in the community that I come from.
You mentioned earlier one of the ways you thought Labour in the 90s and 2000s had maybe looked away from their traditional core, their working class core, if you like, in terms of how New Labour positioned itself. Obviously, one of the things you're most famous for is playing Tony Blair in three big movies. How do you feel about that part of your career and about him?
Well, it's interesting because part of what my job is as an actor is to... I always remember reading this about Laurence Olivier. He said, my job's not to judge these characters. My job is just to try and understand them. And that's always been the case for me, that, part of what I try and do is not to editorialize my performance. It's about just trying to understand and empathize and connect. And inevitably, I played Tony Blair 3 times. My ability to really look in a positive or constructively critical way started to get blurred because I just knew so much about him, one version of him. I would never presume to know, who he really is or what's going on. But it did inevitably make me have to look at things and confront certain things that I wouldn't have needed to had I not been playing him. So it always became, and has subsequently remained, quite difficult for me to just go war criminal or whatever. And I totally sympathise with the people who, and I would, if I hadn't played him, I would be saying the same things, I'm sure. But it did give me an opportunity, I suppose, to look at the actual nuts and bolts and the reality of a day-to-day life of a politician and a prime minister, ultimately. And I'm glad of that, because it means that I can't just sit back into that comfortable position and not deal with the complexity of these and the ambiguity of it and the contradictions of being in these positions. I'm discovering that now myself. I am now sitting down in rooms with people who I fundamentally disagree with on major things, but I have an opportunity to work with them and get something changed. It really makes a difference to how you talk about stuff when you actually have the opportunity to make change. It's one thing when whether you've consciously decided not to get involved. That way, Blair always talked about the idea, I want to be in the room. I don't want to be outside complaining about the people. I want to be in the room making a difference. And I always sort of, I now sympathize with that. Over the last few years, have made quite a few speeches about all kinds of stuff that I feel incredibly passionate about, that I fundamentally disagree with the government about, or whoever it might be. And that might be Labour as well. I did a speech in Tredegar about the NHS where, it's too easy just to go, it's the Tories, it's the Tories. Labour unscrewed a lot of the bolts in the 90s around the NHS that then were able to be exploited by the Tories and the coalition government after that. So I do sympathise with that idea, that it is a lot more complicated once you're in a position of actually changing things. But nevertheless, and this is what I'm negotiating now, I refuse to give up my ability to say what I think is wrong and what I feel is unjust.
And are you ready to be attacked? Because that's going to be the next stage, isn't it? At the moment, you're that popular, famous actor who's giving something back to his community and doing something good, and everybody will laud you for it. But sooner or later, you're going to come under fire for what you're doing and for what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, that's already happened. That's not... yeah, oh gosh, yeah. I mean, I don't think there's anyone in any form of public life and increasingly in private life that doesn't have to deal with a lot of that stuff, a lot of the time. If you're a woman, you deal with it a lot. If you're, of any kind of minority, you have to deal with it a lot. If you have certain kinds of opinions, certain kinds of religion, it doesn't matter whether you're in public life or not, you get it. So I've had a bit of it, and that's fine. And I keep, I suppose, to myself, I keep saying, it doesn't matter what I say, it's what I do. Like, a lot of what people come at me for is, who do you think you are? Why do you think you've got anything to help? You're this Hollywood actor.
Go back to LA.
There's all that. Yeah. And that's fine, that's the easiest to deal with, because you go, well, okay, I'll just carry on doing what I'm doing, and if I make a difference, then great, and it doesn't matter what you say about that. The harder thing is when people, take you on for your ideas and actually make you have to defend, where you're coming from and your point of view and your opinion. And I try not to dismiss that. I try, if it's too easy to go, it's just a hater or a troll on social media. I mean, one of the most useful things as an actor I found were the bad reviews that I got. Some of them are just, whatever, ridiculous. But often I got the most helpful things. If you can get over your own ego being bruised and hurt, I am a novice in all this. I don't know what I'm talking about most of the time in this area. I'm learning as much as I possibly can from people. That's why partly the alliance way of dealing with this stuff is so useful for me, because everyone else are the experts. They're the ones who all know. They're the ones who've had the experience. I'm just there to sort of facilitate in lots of ways and try and learn as much as I can. So if people attack, the way I'm thinking or the ideas and the opinions, if I really take that on board, I can only grow from that. If I can get over the bruised ego stuff. And then the other stuff is just bollocks.
Do you think, is this now the rest of your life? It's very hard once you set down a road to try and make things better. It's quite hard to get off that road, isn't it, until you've made things better? Yeah,
this is, there was football, then there was acting, now there's this, whatever I don't even know what to call it. People say, actor and activist, and I just sort of, it makes my bumhole go in and out, it's like, it's so embarrassing. I just call it the non-acting stuff. This is it, it's not like, that's why when people talk about the campaign, it's not a campaign, this is it, this is what I do now. And the reason why I keep acting is, like I say, because it pays for it. And it gives me leverage, and I'll keep doing it as long as that works.
If you could rewrite the rules to change your world, the world is a big place, do you have a sense of what they would be? Do you have a sense of what your platform would be?
Well, I think if we say broadly speaking, the right talks about the responsibility of the individual to make the most of opportunity, and the left, broadly speaking, talks about equal access to opportunity, then I see my platform then is about combining those two, which is going, yes, once you have an opportunity, it is up to you to make the most of it. But not everybody has equal access to those opportunities, so the two have to come together somehow. So encouraging ambition in a community. You know, people talk about back at home, people say, oh, there's just no ambition. You know, you've got to raise the level of ambition. Well, you can raise the level of ambition, but if the pathways aren't there, then all you're doing is raising the level of frustration. You know, so yes, you have to raise the level of ambition so that and get people used to the idea of that when opportunity comes, that it has to be grabbed, and and that requires vulnerability and taking risk and possibly failing, and that's as much a part of success. Failure is intrinsic to success, all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, it's no good focusing on that if people feel like, well, there's nothing for me there. Like that just doesn't come. You're talking about something that is not part of my experience. So the two have to come together. There is a place for the state, and there is a place for individual excellence and opportunity and achievement. But they have to come together somehow. So it's about doing whatever it takes to level that playing field for people.
I've asked everybody on this podcast, what's your most controversial opinion, if you like? I mean, do you have one sort of thing that you know, that's going to be unpopular, but it's what I believe?
Oh, my goodness. I don't know. I tend to... I mean, I'm trying to, I suppose, to not have too many opinions, in a way, that it needs to be connected to experience. I feel like, I think when I've got into trouble myself, not just in trouble with other people, but in trouble with my own sense of, what am I doing here? What I'm saying doesn't seem to go with what I'm doing, all that kind of stuff. It's because it's coming from my head too much, and it's not coming from just listening to other people, listening to the experience of people, what's going on here. And I suppose the most controversial thing is to say the change has to be in you. You have to do something about this. Like I've had to change my life. Now, people go, well, you're a Hollywood actor. You've got loads of money. Of course you can change your life. We all have to do that in some way or another. I suppose that's the most controversial thing, ultimately. And until we each make that change, things will stay the same.
Michael Sheen, thank you very much indeed.